Now, we move from Corinth to Ephesus, where young Timothy is receiving instruction from his mentor Paul. In 1 Timothy 2:12, "But I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." Hopefully by now you've learned that we have to put this verse in context. So let's back up to verse 8. "Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A woman must receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." Okay, so, honest question. How many of you get really upset by braided hair in church? And don't you think we should require all men to always lift up their hands if they're praying? I mean, if their hands aren't lifted up, then they're doing it wrong, right? And again, I have no doubt that Paul was offering sound advice for Timothy's specific cultural context. But we can't choose to cement and canonize one specific application and then choose to be dismissive of the others. We can't do that when they're set within the same structure and context. So rather than transplanting specific practices from Ephesus to San Antonio, what if we look for the timeless principles instead? Paul starts with, "I want men to pray without wrath or dissension." Okay, good start, right? Let's not have angry, condescending prayer rants. I think we can all agree on that. Then he says, "Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing." Again, that seems to be a reasonable principle. Obviously, specific fashion trends have changed a bit, but the principle still applies. Be proper in your dress. This is the idea of propriety. Now, why do you think Paul talks to women about improper dress and men about angry prayers? A man could dress inappropriately. A woman could pray with wrath. I don't think it's a leap to assume that Paul is addressing specific concerns. Based on reports from Timothy or those familiar with issues in Ephesian culture, it seems that some of the men were being angry in prayer, pointing at the other congregants. So he tells them to knock it off, point your hands toward God, and pray without malice. It also seems safe to assume that he would expect the same of the women who were praying, but he didn't specifically address the women because they weren't guilty of that particular practice at that particular time in that particular place. But we can still apply the same principle to both men and women regarding the attitudes of our prayers or the propriety of our clothing. Paul then continues by addressing how a woman should learn. Specifically, she should learn with quietness and submission. Now let's again recognize the revolutionary point that women are encouraged to learn. That's a big deal. Paul wants women to learn. This is a huge step towards equality. So we want women to learn, but how should they learn? Peacefully, quietly, submissively. And isn't that pretty much the best way to learn? Is there a better posture for learning? If Paul were to instruct the men in their manner of receiving instructions, what do you think he might say? How about a man should learn with quietness and submission? What about a child or a teenager? Well, they too should learn with peaceful submission. It's a really good posture for learning. But once they learn, what can they do with that learning? Can they teach? Verse 12 says, "I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." Quick jump. Acts 18, 24 through 26. "Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, a learned man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately." Notice that Apollos was violating one of our earlier Pauline principles, learn before you teach. He was doing his best, but his message was incomplete. So Priscilla and Aquila took him aside and gave him a more complete education. They taught him. Both of them, they took him aside and they taught him. Now, Greek is an interesting language. When nouns are listed, they are usually listed in order of importance. So almost always a man's name will be listed before his wife's name, but not here. By saying Priscilla and Aquila, Luke seems to be giving a nod to the female leader of this power couple. Also notice where this instruction took place, in Ephesus. Priscilla was in Ephesus, the same town where Paul seems to be saying, I do not allow a woman to teach. That's a location with an established female teacher. Now, do you think Paul disapproved of this female pastor? No, not at all. In his second letter to Timothy, he makes a point of saying, greet Prisca and Aquila. Look at that. Paul does the same thing as Luke. He lists her first. That doesn't seem like something a chauvinist would do. That doesn't read like someone who disapproves of women in ministry. Also, notice that Paul uses a more familiar name. Why would Paul use a nickname? Because they were close. Paul lived with her and Aquila while making tents in Corinth. Paul clearly approved of, clearly endorsed her ministry. She was one of his students, one of his co-workers, one of his beloved friends. So why would he say that he doesn't permit a woman to teach? Perhaps it's because most of the women in Ephesus were still learning. And remember, if you're still learning, then you're not ready to speak or teach. But I think the better case is made that Paul is not restricting women teachers at all, but rather is addressing the manner in which they teach, just like he addressed the manner of prayer and the manner of dress just before. Interestingly, in English, teach and exercise authority, or domineer is another way to say that. In English, they are separate verbs. But in Greek, domineer is not a separate verb, but a qualifying verb. So it's something more like, I do not allow a woman to teach in a domineering manner. Now, most of us are familiar with the KJV. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority. I think it would be fair to say that in Bible classes, we should not use combative language. But that's different than saying we should not use language and we shouldn't engage in combat. Obviously, we shouldn't be combative, but not using language in Bible class would seem counterproductive. Do you see where I'm going? We need qualifying verbs to address the manner of teaching, but that's very different from restricting teaching. Paul starts by saying that men shouldn't be wrathful in their prayers, and then he reminds women not to be domineering in their teaching. And of course, we can make the case that no one, neither man nor woman, should usurp authority. God grants authority to some, and we must choose to accept or reject that authority. Interestingly, one of the misapplications of this passage seemed to be a subtle way of men usurping authority by denying that sometimes authority may be given by God to a woman to teach. Something to think about.